Something just happened after the very first race of the 2026 Formula One season, and it has already pushed the FIA into action. Mercedes didn't just win the Australian Grand Prix. They dominated it. Pole position. Fastest pace all weekend. And a crushing 1-2 finish with George Russell in first and Kimi Antonelli right behind him. At first, it looked like the perfect start to a championship campaign. But only hours after the checkered flag in Melbourne, rival teams began digging into the race data. And what they discovered shocked the entire paddock. Acceleration bursts that looked stronger than anything else on the grid. Energy deployment patterns engineers did not expect to see under the new regulations. And performance spikes that some analysts believe could be worth nearly 30 extra horsepower in certain moments of the lap. 30 horsepower. In Formula One, that is the difference between fighting for the win and fighting just to stay in the top 10. Ferrari has already admitted they are nowhere near Mercedes. Red Bull finished more than 50 seconds behind the leaders. And now several teams are furious about what they believe the Mercedes engine is doing under the new hybrid rules. So furious, in fact, that the FIA has launched a deeper investigation into the data coming from the W17 power unit after the Australian Grand Prix. Because if Mercedes has discovered a hidden trick inside the 2026 engine regulations, then the performance we saw in Melbourne might only be the beginning of a much bigger controversy. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why the Mercedes engine has suddenly become the most talked about piece of technology in Formula One. And why this investigation could completely change the battle for the 2026 championship. Right from the beginning of the Australian Grand Prix weekend, there were already signs that Mercedes had arrived in 2026 with something special. The first practice sessions in Melbourne immediately caught the attention of the paddock. George Russell looked comfortable. The car looked stable. And the lap times started raising eyebrows. During the final practice session, Russell delivered a lap that shocked several teams. A 1 minute 19.053. More than 6/10 faster than the closest Ferrari. In modern Formula One, that kind of gap is enormous. Especially in the first race of a completely new regulation era, where most teams are still trying to understand their cars. But the Mercedes W17 looked like it had already solved the puzzle. Then came qualifying. And the Mercedes became even more impressive. Russell produced a near-perfect lap to secure pole position with a 1 minute 18.518. Right behind him on the grid was his teammate, Kimi Antonelli. A complete Mercedes front row. For Antonelli, it was a powerful statement. The young driver had already shown flashes of speed in previous seasons, but this was different. This was the first race of a completely new Formula One era. And he was starting on the front row next to his teammate in what looked like the fastest car on the grid. But when the race started on Sunday, the story took an unexpected turn. When the lights went out, both Mercedes drivers struggled to launch cleanly. Charles Leclerc reacted faster and jumped into the lead at the first corner. For several laps, it looked like Ferrari might actually control the race. Russell and Leclerc exchanged positions in an intense early battle. The new 2026 overtake mode created a fascinating dynamic. Every time Russell activated it, the Mercedes surged forward with powerful acceleration. But every time he used that extra energy, the battery drained quickly. And that allowed Leclerc to fight back once the Mercedes had less electrical power available. So the opening laps turned into a cycle. Attack. Counterattack. Recharge. Then attack again. It was one of the clearest examples of how the new hybrid regulations are changing the rhythm of racing in Formula One. But then the race reached the moment that completely changed everything. A virtual safety car was triggered after the Red Bull of Isaac Hadjar stopped on track with a mechanical failure. Mercedes reacted instantly. Both Russell and Antonelli entered the pit lane at exactly the same time. A perfectly executed double pit stop under the virtual safety car. That decision completely transformed the race. Ferrari chose to stay out on track. But once the race restarted, Russell suddenly had something extremely valuable. Clean air ahead of him. And from that moment forward, the pace of the Mercedes became impossible to ignore. Russell began managing the race from the front, controlling the gap and carefully balancing tire wear and energy deployment. Behind him, Antonelli recovered from his poor start and fought his way back through the field. By the final stage of the race, the picture was clear. Russell leading. Antonelli second. Ferrari chasing but unable to close the gap. The race ended exactly that way. A dominant Mercedes 1-2 finish in the opening race of the 2026 season. For Mercedes, it looked like the perfect beginning to a championship campaign. But inside the garages of Ferrari and Red Bull, the reaction was very different. Because engineers were already studying the race data from Melbourne. And what they started seeing in those numbers is exactly what would trigger the growing anger across the paddock, and the FIA investigation that followed. But the moment the celebrations ended in the Mercedes garage, something very different was happening across the rest of the paddock. Because engineers from Ferrari, Red Bull, and several other teams immediately started doing what Formula One teams always do after a race. They opened the telemetry. Every lap, every sector, every acceleration zone around Albert Park. And that is when the first serious questions began to appear. When the data from the Mercedes was placed next to the telemetry from Ferrari and Red Bull, one detail immediately stood out. The acceleration phases. Not the top speed at the end of the straight. Not the cornering speed. The short bursts of power right after the car exited a slow corner. At those exact moments, the Mercedes looked unusually strong. Just a little bit faster each time. A few hundredths of a second here. Another few hundredths there. But those small gains kept repeating again and again across the lap. And when you repeat that advantage 15 or 20 times in one lap, it becomes impossible to ignore. Because suddenly, that small advantage becomes several tenths. Then several seconds over a race distance. That is exactly what rival engineers believe they saw in the data from Melbourne. The Mercedes was not just powerful. It was extremely efficient with how it delivered that power. The electrical deployment looked sharper, more aggressive, perfectly timed with the traction zones of the circuit. Albert Park is a track full of short acceleration bursts. And in those bursts, the Mercedes appeared to have a clear advantage. Some analysts now believe the Mercedes power unit could be producing nearly 30 extra horsepower during certain acceleration phases. 30 horsepower may not sound enormous outside Formula One. But inside this sport, it is massive. Even 10 additional horsepower can completely change the competitive balance between teams. 30 horsepower can transform the entire grid. And that is exactly why the reaction from rival teams after the race was so strong. Ferrari was surprisingly direct about the situation. Charles Leclerc admitted that Ferrari simply could not match the pace of the Mercedes in Australia. He even suggested that most of the difference seemed to come from the engine itself. Red Bull reached a similar conclusion. Max Verstappen finished 6th in the race, more than 50 seconds behind the leading Mercedes. For a team that dominated previous seasons, that result was a serious warning sign. And inside the paddock, the discussion quickly turned toward one possibility. Had Mercedes discovered something inside the new hybrid regulations that the rest of the grid had missed? Because the 2026 power unit rules changed the balance of power dramatically. Electrical deployment now plays a much larger role in the total performance of the car. Which means the teams that manage that energy best can gain a huge advantage. And if Mercedes has truly found a smarter way to deploy that energy within the regulations, the consequences for the championship could be enormous. That is exactly why the FIA has now begun looking more closely at the data from the Australian Grand Prix. Not because Mercedes has been accused of cheating, but because the performance difference is large enough to demand a deeper technical explanation. And the more engineers study the numbers from Melbourne, the more one question keeps appearing inside the paddock. Did Mercedes simply build the best engine of the new era? Or did they discover a loophole in the regulations that nobody else has fully understood yet? And this is where the situation begins to turn from curiosity into real tension inside Formula One. Because when multiple teams start questioning the same thing at the same time, the FIA cannot simply ignore it. And that is exactly what happened after the Australian Grand Prix. Behind closed doors in the paddock, engineers from Ferrari and Red Bull reportedly began comparing their own data with what they observed from the Mercedes during the race. They studied every acceleration zone around Albert Park, every deployment of electrical energy, every moment where the Mercedes seemed to gain time. And the more they analyzed those numbers, the more the same conclusion appeared. The Mercedes power unit was not just powerful. It was incredibly efficient with how it delivered its energy. Especially during those short bursts of acceleration that define modern Formula One performance. Albert Park is not a circuit dominated by long straights. It is a circuit built around short sprints between corners, quick bursts of throttle, short traction zones, rapid acceleration phases where electrical deployment can make the biggest difference. And in those moments, the Mercedes looked almost perfectly optimized. That is why some analysts believe the real secret of the Mercedes engine might not be a mechanical component at all. It could be software. Modern Formula One power units are controlled by incredibly complex energy management systems. Those systems decide exactly when electrical energy is harvested, exactly when it is released, and exactly how aggressively it supports the combustion engine. If one team finds a smarter algorithm to manage that energy, the gains can be enormous. Not in one single straight, but everywhere. Corner after corner. Lap after lap. That is the kind of advantage engineers believe they might be seeing in the data from Melbourne. Because the Mercedes was not just fast once. It was consistently fast in the same critical moments around the circuit. And consistency like that rarely happens by accident. It usually means the system controlling the engine is operating with incredible precision. Which brings us back to the FIA investigation. Right now, the governing body is reviewing the technical data from the Australian Grand Prix to understand exactly how the Mercedes power unit is delivering its performance. This does not mean the team has broken the rules. In fact, many of the greatest technical breakthroughs in Formula One history started exactly like this. One team finds a clever interpretation of the regulations. The others struggle to understand it. And eventually the FIA decides whether that interpretation is acceptable. But if the Mercedes advantage really comes from a smarter way to manage hybrid energy, then the rest of the grid could have a serious problem. Because software advantages are some of the hardest to copy in Formula One. Even if rival teams understand the concept, implementing it correctly could take months of development. And that means Mercedes could potentially build a huge early lead in the championship. Which is exactly why the first race of the 2026 season is already creating so much tension across the paddock. Because what looked like a simple victory in Australia might actually be the beginning of the most important technical battle of the new Formula One era.